Hey guys, tonight we're drifting down the majestic, life-giving River Nile. Not in a creaky wooden boat, but on the gentle currents of historical imagination. Picture the golden sun beating down, the lush green banks teeming with life, and towering, feathery plants swaying in the warm breeze. Tonight, we're unraveling the secrets behind one of the ancient world's most vital innovations, the creation of papyrus rolls by the incredibly skilled scribes of Egypt. We're going beyond the pyramids and pharaohs to explore the daily craft, the meticulous process, and the profound importance of this humble river reed that became the very paper of antiquity, carrying the words of gods, kings, and everyday people across millennia. Now, if you were suddenly tasked with transforming a tough, fibrous swamp plant into a smooth, durable writing surface using only ancient tools and your own ingenuity, you probably won't survive this ancient Egyptian DIY project without a lot of frustration, some very sticky fingers, and perhaps accidentally inventing a rather unappetizing form of pressed vegetable matter instead. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And please do let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. It's always fascinating to see how these ancient crafts and stories resonate across our modern globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself standing on the fertile banks of the Nile, the lifeblood of ancient Egypt, a civilization that flourished for thousands of years, leaving behind a legacy of monumental architecture, intricate religious beliefs, and a rich, complex written tradition. And at the very heart of that written tradition, the literal foundation upon which so much of their history, literature, and administration was recorded, lies a remarkable plant. Cypress papyrus. This isn't just any reed, this is papyrus. A tall, robust aquatic plant that once grew in dense, towering thickets in the shallow waters and marshes of the Nile Delta and along the river's less turbulent edges. Its distinctive feathery umbels, like giant green fireworks exploding at the top of sturdy triangular stalks, would have been a characteristic feature of the Nilotic landscape. You can almost feel the warm, humid air, hear the rustle of the reeds, and see the ibis wading gracefully through the shallows. For the ancient Egyptians, papyrus was far more than just a pretty plant. It was a gift from the Nile, a versatile natural resource that permeated almost every aspect of their daily lives. Its tough outer rind could be used to make ropes, sandals, baskets, mats, and even small boats. Its starchy rhizomes roots were sometimes eaten, and its fluffy flower heads were used for garlands and decorations. But its most celebrated and enduring contribution, the one that allows us to hear the whispers of their civilization today, was its transformation into a smooth, durable, and surprisingly sophisticated writing material. This paper of ancient Egypt was one of their greatest inventions, a technology that would dominate the written communications of the Mediterranean world for over 3,000 years, long before true paper, made from pulped fibers, arrived from China. It's hard to imagine running an empire, administering vast temple estates, or recording complex religious rituals on anything less convenient. Try chiseling your weekly shopping list onto a stone tablet. You develop some serious forearm muscles, but it's not exactly practical for everyday notes. The very word paper in many European languages derives from papyrus, a testament to its foundational importance. A key historical fact is that the use of papyrus as a writing material in Egypt dates back to at least the First Dynasty, around 3000 BCE, making it one of the oldest known writing surfaces. Early examples show a remarkable level of craftsmanship, indicating that the techniques for its manufacture were developed and refined very early in Egyptian history. The papyrus plant itself held symbolic significance for the ancient Egyptians. Its umbel, when viewed from above, resembled the rays of the sun god, Ra. Thickets of papyrus were seen as primordial places, representing the fertile chaos from which the ordered world emerged. The plant was also associated with Wadjet, the cobra goddess and protector of Lower Egypt, where papyrus grew most abundantly. So, when a scribe unrolled a fresh sheet of papyrus, they weren't just handling a piece of stationery, they were engaging with a material imbued with deep cultural and religious meaning. It was a sacred page, born from the sacred river, destined to carry sacred words, or at least some very important tax records. Right, Thothemas. A senior scribe might say to his apprentice, "Remember to treat this papyrus with respect. It's not just for your hieroglyph practice doodles of Bennu birds wearing tiny crowns. This stuff is literally a gift from the gods, and also quite expensive, so don't mess it up." The daily life of the ancient Egyptians, from the grand pronouncements of the pharaoh to the mundane accounts of a temple granary, was increasingly recorded on these versatile rolls. Without papyrus, our knowledge of their intricate bureaucracy, their sophisticated mathematics, their profound religious beliefs, their captivating literature, and their intimate personal letters would be vastly diminished, perhaps confined to the monumental inscriptions on temple walls and tombs. Historians and Egyptologists still explore the nuances of papyrus production and its societal impact. For instance, there's ongoing discussion about the extent to which papyrus manufacturing was a state-controlled monopoly, or if smaller, independent workshops also existed. The control over such a vital resource would have undoubtedly carried significant economic and political power. But before any words could be written, before any scrolls could be filled, the papyrus plant itself had to be gathered from its wild, marshy home. This was the first crucial step in a long and intricate process. A journey from a swaying green reed in the Nile Delta to a smooth, pale sheet ready for the scribe's skilled hand. And it's to that initial, often challenging, harvest that we turn our attention next, stepping into the muddy, sun-drenched world of the ancient Egyptian papyrus gatherers. You're standing now where the mighty Nile fans out into its fertile delta, or perhaps in a quiet, marshy backwater along the river's course. The air is thick with the sounds of unseen creatures, the croak of frogs, the buzz of insects, the splash of a diving kingfisher, towering above you, sometimes reaching heights of 15 feet or more, are dense, almost impenetrable thickets of cypress papyrus, their feathery green heads swaying gently in the breeze that whispers off the water. This is the raw material, the green gold of ancient Egypt. And your task, should you be an ancient Egyptian papyrus harvester, it is to venture into this wild, watery domain and bring back the precious stalks that will eventually become the scrolls of kings, priests, and scribes. This isn't a gentle stroll through a well-tended garden. This is hard, often dangerous, and highly skilled labor. The harvesting of papyrus was a specialized activity, likely undertaken by teams of workers who knew the marshes intimately. They would venture into the dense papyrus beds in small, shallow draft skiffs or boats, probably made from bundles of papyrus reeds themselves, a wonderfully circular use of the material. Imagine gliding through narrow channels, the towering stalks closing in around you, the water teeming with life, both benign and potentially hazardous. Crocodiles were a very real danger in the Nile, as were hippopotami, surprisingly aggressive creatures despite their somewhat comical appearance. And let's not forget the snakes, insects, and the general discomfort of wading through muddy, often stagnant, water under a blazing Egyptian sun. It's not exactly a career path for the faint of heart or those with a strong aversion to leeches. "All right, lads," the foreman might say, "watch out for old Snappy Acrosis the way. He's looking particularly peckish this morning. And try not to fall in. The paperwork to report a hippo-related workplace incident is just a nightmare." The harvesters would be looking for mature papyrus stalks of a specific quality. A key historical fact is that the part of the papyrus stalk used for making the writing material was the inner pith of the triangular stem, particularly the lower, thicker portion that grew submerged or partially submerged in the water. This pith was richer in the cellulose fibers that would eventually bind together to form the papyrus sheet. So, the workers couldn't just lop off the tops. They needed to cut the stalks close to the rhizome, often underwater, a task requiring strength and skill. They would likely use sharp, curved knives or sickles for this purpose. Once cut, the heavy, waterlogged stalks, which could be several inches thick at the base, had to be bundled together and transported out of the marshes back to the workshops where the papyrus sheets would be made. This would involve loading them onto their skiffs or perhaps dragging large bundles through the shallower channels. It was back-breaking work, repeated day after day during the harvesting season. The sheer volume of papyrus required to supply the needs of a civilization as literate and administratively complex as ancient Egypt would have been immense, necessitating a continuous and well-organized harvesting operation. The best quality papyrus often came from specific regions of the delta, where the growing conditions were optimal. There was likely a distinction made between wild papyrus, which was plentiful, and perhaps cultivated or managed papyrus beds, which might have been maintained to ensure a steady supply of prime stocks for high-quality writing material, especially for royal or temple use. A quirky, though perhaps less documented, tidbit might involve certain rituals or appeals to local marsh deities or spirits to ensure a safe and successful harvest. Given the dangers involved and the importance of the crop, it wouldn't be surprising if the harvesters had their own set of protective charms or customary offerings. A little prayer to Sobek before we head into that particularly dense patch where young Mena lost his favorite sandals last week. Can't hurt. The timing of the harvest might also have been important. Papyrus stalks, like many plants, would have optimal periods for cutting, when their pith was at its best for papermaking, not too young and soft, not too old and woody. The experienced harvesters would have known exactly when and where to cut to get the best yield of A-grade papyrus pith, the stuff destined for the pharaoh's edicts or a high priest's sacred texts, as opposed to the slightly rougher material that might end up as a schoolboy's practice sheet or a merchant's quick accounts. Historians and botanists still debate some of the specifics of ancient papyrus cultivation and harvesting. For example, to what extent was papyrus actively cultivated in managed plantations versus being primarily harvested from wild stands? And how did environmental changes in the Nile Delta over millennia affect the availability and quality of the plant? The papyrus plant, while once abundant, is now much rarer in Egypt outside of a few protected areas or deliberate cultivation efforts, partly due to changes in the Nile's hydrology, especially after the construction of the Aswan High Dam and habitat loss. But in its heyday, the papyrus harvest was a vital first step in a long chain of production that fueled Egyptian literacy and administration. As you watch these ancient workers, knee-deep in the muddy waters, their sickles flashing in the sun, skillfully selecting and cutting the tall green stalks, you gain a new appreciation for the effort that went into every single sheet of papyrus. It wasn't just paper, it was the product of hard labor, expert knowledge of the natural world, and a deep understanding of the unique properties of this remarkable Nile reed. The journey from a swaying stalk in a sun-drenched marsh to a smooth, inscribed scroll in a scribe's hand was just beginning. The heavy, dripping bundles of freshly cut papyrus stalks have arrived from the Nile marshes, transported by boat or perhaps by weary laborers to the bustling workshops where the real magic of transformation is about to happen. You are now stepping into the heart of an ancient Egyptian papyrus-making operation, a place filled with the sounds of slicing and pounding, the scent of damp vegetable matter, and the focused industry of skilled artisans. This isn't a grand temple or royal palace, but a humble yet vitally important center of production where the raw gift of the Nile is meticulously crafted into the smooth, pale sheets that will carry the words of a civilization. The journey from stalk to sheet is a testament to ancient ingenuity and a surprisingly delicate yet multi-stage process. First, the preparation of the stalks. The long, triangular stems, still green and waterlogged, would be brought into the workshop. The feathery umbel at the top, while beautiful, was useless for papermaking and would be discarded or perhaps used for decoration. The tough green outer rind of the stalk also had to be carefully peeled away. This was likely done with a sharp knife, a task requiring a steady hand to avoid damaging the precious inner pith. Imagine a worker, perhaps seated on a low stool, skillfully stripping away this outer layer, much like peeling a very large, very fibrous piece of celery, revealing the creamy white cellular core within. This pith was the true treasure, the part that contained the long cellulose fibers that would form the basis of the papyrus sheet. It's a bit like getting to the good stuff in an artichoke. You have to get through a lot of less exciting outer bits first. Careful with that rind. Nefer. The workshop foreman might instruct, "We're making writing material for the vizier's accounts, not betting for the sacred ibis." Precision. My boy. Precision. Once the pith was exposed, the next critical step was to slice it into thin, translucent strips. This was perhaps the most skilled part of the entire process. The artisan would take a section of the pith and, using a very sharp, specialized knife or tool, cut it longitudinally into long, delicate ribbons, as thin and as wide as possible. The quality of the final papyrus sheet depended heavily on the evenness and fineness of these strips. A key historical fact, evident from examining surviving ancient papyrus sheets, is that the Egyptians were capable of slicing these strips with remarkable precision, often achieving a near paper-thin consistency. It was a task that demanded immense concentration and manual dexterity. One slip of the knife could ruin a whole section of valuable pith. Now comes the ingenious part: sheet formation. A flat, smooth surface, perhaps a wooden board or a stone slab, would be moistened with Nile water. Then, the freshly cut papyrus strips would be laid out upon this surface in two perpendicular layers. First, a row of strips would be placed side by side, their edges slightly overlapping. Then, a second layer of strips would be laid on top, at a right angle to the first, again with slight overlaps. It was like creating a miniature woven mat, but with delicate, moist vegetable fibers instead of threads. The natural glutinous sap within the papyrus pith itself, released by the slicing and perhaps aided by the Nile water, acted as the primary adhesive, bonding the two layers together as they dried under pressure. No external glue was typically needed for high-quality papyrus, though some lower-grade sheets might have used a little flour paste. It's like the papyrus had its own built-in organic superglue. Remember, apprentices, the master papyrus maker might say, overlap just enough for a good bond, but not so much that you create a thick, lumpy monstrosity fit only for wrapping fish. Elegance, even in adhesion. Once the two layers were carefully arranged, the entire assemblage would be subjected to intense pressure. This was likely done by placing another board on top, and then either hammering it forcefully or putting it under a heavy press, perhaps a screw press or a weighted lever press, for several days. This pressing action served multiple purposes. It squeezed out excess water. It forced the two layers of papyrus strips into intimate contact, allowing their natural gums to bind them securely. And it compacted the fibers into a thin, dense, and relatively uniform sheet. After pressing, the newly formed sheets of papyrus, still damp, would be carefully peeled from the pressing board and laid out in the sun to dry completely. Once dry, the surface would often be polished to create a smoother, more receptive surface for the scribe's reed pen. This might be done by rubbing it with a smooth stone, a piece of ivory, or a shell. The aim was to create a writing surface that was not too absorbent, so the ink wouldn't feather or bleed, but also not so slick that the ink wouldn't adhere. A quirky tidbit is that the front of a papyrus sheet, the recto, where the strips ran horizontally, was generally considered the preferred writing surface, as the scribe's pen would move more smoothly with the grain of these fibers. The back, the verso, hainone, with its vertical fibers, was often rougher and used less frequently, perhaps for less important texts, drafts, or notes, though many surviving papyri are written on both sides. Historians and experimental archaeologists continue to replicate the ancient papyrus-making process to better understand its nuances. There are still debates about certain details, such as the exact tools used for slicing the pith, the specific methods of pressing, and whether any additional sizing agents to control ink absorption were commonly applied to the surface. However, the fundamental principles of layering and pressing the fibrous strips are well established from both ancient descriptions like those of Pliny the Elder, a Roman writer who described the process, albeit with some possible inaccuracies in modern experimentation. The result of all this meticulous labor was a beautiful, pale, flexible, and surprisingly durable sheet of writing material, ready to receive the hieroglyphs. Hieratic script, or later, the Greek and Coptic letters that would record the thoughts, deeds, and dreams of ancient Egypt. Each sheet was a small miracle of ancient technology, a testament to the skill of artisans who could transform a humble river reed into the very foundation of a literate civilization. The journey from stalk to sheet was complete. Now, it was time to make these individual pages into something even more useful, the mighty papyrus roll. The skilled artisans in the bustling Egyptian workshop have worked their magic. Those tall, light green papyrus stalks, harvested with such effort from the Nile marshes, have been transformed into individual, smooth, pale sheets of writing material. You've witnessed the peeling, the slicing, the intricate layering, the pressing, and the sun-drying. But a single sheet of papyrus, while useful for a short letter or a quick note, isn't sufficient for a lengthy religious text, a detailed administrative record, or a grand literary work. For those, you need something much longer, the iconic papyrus scroll. And so, the next crucial stage in this ancient manufacturing process is the artful joining of these individual sheets, or kolamata, as they were known, into a continuous roll, sometimes stretching for many meters, ready for the scribe's patiently waiting reed pen. This wasn't just a case of slapping a bit of glue between pages and hoping for the best. Crafting a high-quality papyrus scroll, one that would be both durable and convenient for the scribe to use and for the eventual reader to handle, required considerable skill and attention to detail. The aim was to create joins that were as smooth and unobtrusive as possible, so that the scribe's pen wouldn't snag or skip as it moved from one sheet to the next. A lumpy, badly joined scroll would be a nightmare to write on, and probably wouldn't fetch a very good price in the papyrus market. Honestly, Horam Heb. A frustrated scribe might complain to his supplier. "This last batch of scrolls you sent, the joins are so rough. My reed pen keeps catching. It looks like a drunken hippo tried to assemble them. My hieroglyphs for divine majesty are starting to look more like slightly perturbed waterfowl." The process typically began by selecting sheets of similar quality, thickness, and color. A key historical fact is that papyrus sheets were often graded by quality, with the finest, smoothest, and whitest material often made from the innermost pith of the stalk being reserved for the most important documents or for wealthy clients. When assembling a scroll, the papyrus maker would try to use sheets from the same batch or of a comparable grade to ensure a consistent writing surface. The standard method for joining the sheets was to overlap their edges by a small amount, typically about 1 or 2 centimeters less than an inch. A thin, strong adhesive, usually a paste made from flour and water, or perhaps a finer gum-based glue, would be applied to the overlapping edge of one sheet. The next sheet would then be carefully laid on top, its edge aligned with the first, and the two would be pressed firmly together to create a secure bond. This join was called a collasis. The crucial detail here is the direction of the overlap. The Egyptians ingeniously arranged it so that the right-hand edge of each sheet was glued over the left-hand edge of the preceding sheet when the scroll was oriented for a right-to-left script like hieratic, or in columns read from right to left. This meant that as a right-handed scribe wrote across the join, from right to left, their pen would be moving from the upper layer onto the lower layer, a smoother transition that was less likely to catch the tip of the reed. It's a small detail, but one that speaks volumes about their thoughtful craftsmanship and their concern for the practicalities of writing. It's like designing a modern road with perfectly smooth transitions between a bridge and the main carriageway. It just makes for a better user experience. A standard scroll would typically consist of about 20 of these joined sheets, creating a roll that, when fully extended, might be several meters long, perhaps 5 to 10 meters, or 16 to 33 feet, though some funerary scrolls like the Book of the Dead could be much, much longer, occasionally exceeding 30 or 40 meters. If an even longer scroll was required, multiple standard rolls could themselves be joined together. Once all the sheets were joined, the long, continuous strip of papyrus would often be rolled up with the recto, the preferred writing side, with the horizontal fibers on the inside. This protected the primary writing surface. Sometimes a wooden roller or rod, called an umbilicus by the later Romans, might be attached to one or both ends of the scroll to make it easier to handle, to provide rigidity, and to prevent the innermost part from being too tightly crimped. A quirky tidbit, these rollers were sometimes made of fine wood or even ivory, and might be adorned with decorative knobs, cornuas, especially for deluxe scrolls, adding a touch of elegance to the finished product. It was the ancient equivalent of a beautifully bound hardcover book with gilt edges and a silk ribbon marker. The finished scroll would then often be trimmed to a uniform height, and its surface might receive a final polishing or sizing to ensure it was perfectly ready for the scribe. The quality control would have been important, especially for scrolls destined for temple libraries, royal archives, or the funerary equipment of high-ranking officials. A poorly made scroll, prone to tearing at the joins or with a rough, uneven surface, would reflect badly on both the maker and the institution that commissioned it. Historians and papyrologists still study the minute details of scroll construction: the width of the overlaps, the types of adhesives used, the number of sheets per roll, as these can sometimes provide clues about the date, origin, or even the specific workshop where a scroll was made. The archaeology of the book in its earliest papyrus form is a fascinating field. And so, through this careful, methodical process of joining and finishing, a collection of individual papyrus sheets was transformed into a continuous, elegant roll, a blank canvas waiting to be filled with the words, symbols, and images of ancient Egyptian civilization. This humble, yet sophisticated, artifact was the primary vehicle for transmitting complex information across space and time for millennia, a testament to the enduring ingenuity of those who first learned to craft these resilient pages from the reeds of the sacred Nile. The stage was now perfectly set for the scribe to begin their vital work. The long, pale brown papyrus scroll, meticulously crafted from countless joined sheets, now lies ready, perhaps on a low wooden table or across the lap of its intended user. But before a single hieroglyph or a line of cursive hieratic script can grace its smooth surface, you need to understand the essential tools of the trade, the carefully prepared materials that were the constant companions of every ancient Egyptian scribe. This wasn't just a matter of grabbing any old pen and a piece of paper. The scribe's kit was a specialized, almost sacred collection of implements, each one honed by centuries of tradition and practical experience, designed to transform thoughts and words into enduring written records. It was the ancient equivalent of a high-end graphic designer's treasured set of Wacom tablets and perfectly calibrated monitors, but with a lot more reed sharpening involved. The most fundamental tool, of course, was the scribe's pen. This wasn't a feather quill like those used later in medieval Europe, nor a metal nib. The ancient Egyptian scribe typically used a thin, hollow reed. Juncus maritimus was a common type, carefully cut and prepared. One end of the reed would be bruised or splayed, and then trimmed to create a fine, brush-like tip. A key historical fact is that the scribe could vary the thickness of the line by altering the pressure on this brush-like tip, allowing for a nuanced and expressive script, particularly with the cursive hieratic and later demotic forms. For more formal hieroglyphs, which were often drawn or painted rather than written quickly, different types of brushes made from finer reeds or even animal hair might also have been used. The scribe would likely carry several of these reed pens, perhaps of different thicknesses or states of wear, ready for different tasks. And just like a modern artist with their favorite brushes, a scribe probably had a preferred reed pen, one that just felt right in their hand. "Don't touch my lucky Nile Delta reed." Apprentice. That's the one I use for writing particularly stern letters from Pharaoh. It has just the right amount of judgmental flick at the end of each stroke. Next, you need ink. The ancient Egyptians primarily used two colors of ink, black and red. Black ink, the standard for most writing, was typically made from fine carbon soot, often scraped from cooking pots or oil lamps, mixed with a binder, usually a weak solution of gum arabic or resin from the acacia tree. This mixture was then dried into small, solid cakes or pellets. To use it, the scribe would dip their moistened reed pen onto the cake of ink. Much like using a modern watercolor palette. Red ink, made from finely ground red ochre, an iron oxide pigment mixed with a similar gum binder, was used for emphasis for headings, titles, dates, the names of gods or kings, and to mark important sections in a text. Or for corrections. It was the ancient equivalent of using bold or a different font color in a modern document. You can almost hear a senior scribe instructing a trainee. Remember, Pepi, the name of the divine Apep, that serpent of chaos, is always to be written in red, for it is a name of ill omen, and try not to smudge it, or Apep might take it personally. He's touchy like that. These precious inks, along with other essential items, were kept in a scribe's palette. A typical scribal palette, many examples of which have survived and can be seen in museums today, was a long, narrow, rectangular piece of wood, or sometimes ivory or stone. It would have two or more shallow circular depressions or wells at one end to hold the cakes of black and red ink. The rest of the palette often had a slot or groove running down its length to hold a selection of reed pens. It was a beautifully compact and portable writing kit, the ancient Egyptian version of a fully loaded pencil case or a small laptop. Some palettes were plain and utilitarian, others, belonging to high-ranking scribes, could be elaborately carved and decorated, perhaps inscribed with the owner's name and titles, a true status symbol, to moisten the ink cakes and to clean their pens. Scribes would also need a small water pot, often made of pottery or stone, and for smoothing out rough spots on the papyrus before writing, or for making erasures a tricky business. As we'll see, they might use a small, smooth pebble or a piece of pumice stone. A burnisher, perhaps made of ivory or a polished stone, could also be used to give a final gloss to a completed section of writing, or to flatten out any creases in the papyrus. A quirky, though essential, part of a scribe's toolkit might also have been a cord or a strip of leather used to tie up completed scrolls, and perhaps a cylindrical and in container, a capsa in Latin. Though the Egyptian term might differ, made of wood, leather, or pottery, to protect the valuable papyrus roll from damage, dust, and pests. The scribe would often work seated on the ground, cross-legged, with the papyrus scroll unrolled across their lap or on a low wooden board. They would hold their palette in one hand and their reed pen in the other, writing in columns from right to left for hieratic and demotic, though hieroglyphs could be written in columns or rows, and in different directions depending on aesthetic or symbolic considerations. It required a steady hand, good posture to avoid backache during the long hours of writing, and intense concentration. Historians and Egyptologists continue to learn about the specifics of scribal tools and techniques through the careful study of surviving artifacts, depictions of scribes in tomb paintings and reliefs, and the analysis of the written papyri themselves. There are still debates, for instance, about the exact methods used to sharpen or prepare the reed pens to achieve different effects, or the precise recipes for certain specialized inks or pigments used in illustrations. But what is abundantly clear is that the ancient Egyptian scribe was a master of their craft, and their toolkit, though seemingly simple by our standards, was perfectly adapted to the task of capturing the complexities of their language and the richness of their civilization onto the enduring surface of papyrus. Each carefully chosen reed, each meticulously ground pigment, each well-worn palette was a testament to a tradition of literacy and record-keeping that spanned millennia. These weren't just tools, they were the instruments of an empire's memory. Okay, I understand. We'll continue our journey into the world of ancient Egyptian scribes and their craft, with sections 7 through 11 focusing on the creation of their vital inks, the art of writing on papyrus, the beautiful adornments of their scrolls, how they handled inevitable mistakes, and the vast array of texts they so diligently recorded. Let the story of ink and reed continue. You're now deeply familiar with the journey of the papyrus plant, from a swaying reed in the Nile marshes to a smooth, pale sheet, expertly joined into a long, inviting scroll. You've also peeked into the scribe's essential toolkit, the reed pens, the water pot, the burnisher, and that all-important palette with its hollowed-out wells. But what exactly filled those wells? What were the magical, enduring substances that allowed the scribes to make their marks, to bring forth hieroglyphs and hieratic script that have, in many cases, lasted for thousands of years? We're diving into the fascinating and sometimes surprisingly complex world of ancient Egyptian ink making, a craft that combined readily available natural materials with a good deal of practical chemistry and perhaps even a touch of what seemed like magic to the uninitiated. This wasn't just about finding something that would stain the papyrus. It was about creating inks that were durable, legible, and suitable for the specific demands of their sacred and administrative tasks. The two workhorse colors for any Egyptian scribe, as we've touched upon, were black and red. Black ink, used for the main body of most texts, needed to be dark, permanent, and flow smoothly from the reed pen. The primary pigment for this was carbon, in the form of fine soot. A key historical fact is that this soot was often collected by carefully burning organic materials like oil in lamps and scraping off the fine black powder that accumulated, or perhaps from the residue of fires in ovens or kilns. This lamp black or carbon black was then meticulously ground into an extremely fine powder. The finer the grind, the smoother and more consistent the ink. Imagine a scribe's apprentice, perhaps whose early duties included the tedious but vital task of soot collection and grinding. A dusty, messy job, but one that was fundamental to the entire writing process. Right, young Nebaman, the master scribe might say. Your hieroglyphs for patience are looking a bit shaky today. Perhaps another hour of grinding soot will help you appreciate the virtue. Try not to sneeze directly into the master batch this time. We don't want gritty divine decrees. This finely ground carbon powder then needed a binder to hold it in suspension and allow it to adhere to the papyrus surface once dry. The most common binder was a dilute solution of gum arabic, a natural resin harvested from various species of acacia trees, which were plentiful in Egypt and the surrounding regions. The gum would be dissolved in water, and the carbon powder carefully mixed in to create a stable, liquid ink. The proportions would have been crucial. Too much gum, and the ink might be too thick or crack when dry, too little. And it might not adhere well or could be easily smudged. The Egyptians, through centuries of experimentation, perfected these recipes to create an ink that was remarkably stable, light-fast resistant to fading, and relatively inert, which is one reason why so many ancient papyri remain legible today. It's like they had a secret, divinely inspired recipe for permanent markers, but made from stuff you could find in your backyard if your backyard was ancient Egypt. Of course, red ink, used for headings rubrics, hence our word rubric from the Latin ruber, meaning red titles, key phrases, dates, the names of dangerous entities like the serpent Apep, or to mark corrections or new sections, provided a vibrant contrast to the black. The pigment for red ink was typically finely ground red ochre, a naturally occurring iron oxide mineral that yields a rich, earthy red color, like the carbon for black ink. The ochre would be powdered and mixed with a gum arabic binder and water. The Egyptians were masters at sourcing and processing mineral pigments, not just for inks but also for the paints used in tomb decorations and other artworks. While black and red were the mainstays, other colors were occasionally used for more elaborate or illustrated papyri, such as the magnificent funerary scrolls known as the Book of the Dead. These could include blues often from Egyptian blue, a synthetic pigment they invented, made from silica, lime, copper, and an alkali. Greens from malachite or synthetic copper-based pigments. yellows from yellow ochre or orpiment, and white from chalk or gypsum. These colored inks or paints would have been prepared with similar care, using finely ground pigments and appropriate binders, and applied with finer brushes rather than the standard reed pen. A quirky tidbit that often fascinates people is the question of whether ancient Egyptian inks contained any magical or ritualistic ingredients, especially for sacred texts. While the primary components were practical and material carbon, like ochre, gum, it's not impossible that for certain highly sacred documents, scribes might have added other substances believed to have amuletic or protective properties, or perhaps recited specific incantations during the ink-making process. However, concrete archaeological or textual evidence for this is sparse, and most analyses show the inks to be based on fairly straightforward, though expertly prepared, recipes. The magic was perhaps more in the words being written than in the ink itself. Historians and archaeochemists continue to analyze surviving ancient Egyptian ink samples to better understand their composition and manufacturing techniques. There's ongoing debate, for example, about the precise sources of their carbon. Was it always lampblack? Or did they use other forms of charcoal? Variations in gum Arabic recipes, and the methods they used to achieve such consistent quality and durability over millennia. The level of sophistication in their ink technology, achieved with relatively simple materials, is a constant source of admiration. Once prepared, these inks were typically dried into solid cakes or pellets, which the scribe would then reconstitute with a little water on their palette as needed. This made them portable and prevented them from drying out or spilling during transport or storage. The daily life of a scribe would have involved the regular, almost ritualistic preparation of their writing surface by moistening these ink cakes. It was a small but essential act, connecting them directly to the alchemy of their craft, transforming humble soot and earth into the very medium that would carry their words across time. The secret was in the recipe, honed over generations, ensuring that the whispers from papyrus would not easily fade. The papyrus scroll lies unrolled before you, its pale surface smooth and inviting. Thanks to the meticulous efforts of the papyrus makers, your scribe's palette is ready, the cakes of black and red ink patiently awaiting a touch of moisture. Your reed pen, carefully trimmed to a fine brush-like tip, feels comfortable in your hand. Now comes the moment of truth, the transformation of thought into enduring written form. The careful dance of pen on papyrus that was the daily defining act of the ancient Egyptian scribe. This wasn't just about slapping some hieroglyphs onto a page. It was an art, a skill, and a discipline, governed by established conventions and fraught with its own unique challenges. Imagine yourself as that scribe, perhaps seated cross-legged on a mat, the papyrus scroll spread across your knees or on a low, sloping writing board. You dip your reed pen into the small water pot, then gently rub it onto the cake of black ink on your palette, gathering just the right amount of pigment. Too little, and your lines will be faint and scratchy. Too much, and the ink might blob or bleed on the absorbent papyrus surface. This delicate control of ink flow was a fundamental skill, learned through long practice. It's like learning to use a traditional dip pen or a calligraphy brush today. There's a tactile feedback, a sensitivity to the materials, that a modern ballpoint pen user might never experience. Not too dry, not too wet. Your scribal master might have drilled into you. The ink must flow like the Nile in gentle inundation, not like a flash flood or a dried-up wadi. The direction of writing in ancient Egypt varied depending on the script and the context. Hieroglyphs, those beautiful pictorial symbols used primarily for monumental inscriptions and religious texts, could be written in columns or horizontal lines and could be read from right to left or left to right. The direction the animal and human figures faced usually indicated the starting point. However, for the more everyday cursive scripts used for administrative documents, letters, literary texts, and most writing on papyrus, namely hieratic and in later periods, demotic, the standard direction was from right to left, usually in horizontal lines, with the papyrus scroll being unrolled from the left and rolled up on the right as the scribe progressed. This right-to-left flow is a key historical fact about the practical use of these cursive scripts. It meant a right-handed scribe would be drawing their hand away from the freshly inked text, minimizing the risk of smudging, a very practical consideration. Writing on papyrus presented its own unique challenges. While a well-made sheet was smooth, the underlying texture of the crisscrossed fibers could still be felt. The scribe had to adapt their pen strokes to work with this grain, not against it. The absorbency of the papyrus also had to be managed. A well-prepared sheet would take the ink cleanly, but a poorly made one, or one that was too old and brittle, might cause the ink to feather or bleed. And papyrus, while surprisingly durable when kept dry, was still susceptible to tearing if handled roughly, or if the reed pen snagged on a loose fiber. Precision and a light, controlled touch were paramount. It wasn't like banging out an email on a keyboard. Every stroke was a commitment. One bad hieroglyph could throw off the whole aesthetic of a column. "Curse these cheap delta reeds," a scribe might mutter under his breath. "This one keeps catching on the vertical fibers like a chariot in a sand dune." The scribe would typically write in columns of text, carefully managing the layout and spacing to create a legible and aesthetically pleasing page. Margins would be left at the top and bottom, and between columns. For important documents, guidelines might be lightly ruled onto the papyrus beforehand, perhaps using a blunt reed or a piece of lead to ensure the lines of text were straight and evenly spaced, though experienced scribes could often produce remarkably regular script without such aids. A quirky and rather endearing tidbit is that scribes would sometimes practice their writing or jot down notes and calculations on cheaper materials like ostraca, broken pieces of pottery or limestone flakes, which were readily available and much less expensive than precious papyrus. These ostraca provide us with fascinating glimpses into the daily lives, training exercises, and even the doodles of ancient Egyptian scribes, showing them practicing individual hieroglyphs, copying out model letters, or even sketching little cartoons. It was their ancient equivalent of a scratch pad or a post-it note. The speed of writing would vary greatly depending on the script and the nature of the document. Formal hieroglyphs, especially those intended for a beautifully illustrated funerary papyrus like a Book of the Dead, would be drawn with meticulous care, each sign a miniature work of art. Cursive hieratic, used for administrative texts, letters, and literary works, could be written much more rapidly, with the signs often simplified and ligatured joined together for speed. Demotic, which developed in the later periods of Egyptian history, was an even more abbreviated and cursive script, allowing for very swift writing, though it's notoriously difficult for modern Egyptologists to decipher. Historians and papyrologists continue to study the paleography, the study of ancient handwriting of Egyptian scripts to understand regional variations, chronological developments, and even the individual hands of different scribes. The way a particular scribe formed their letters, their characteristic flourishes or abbreviations, can sometimes be as distinctive as a modern signature. So, as your reed pen moves across the papyrus, leaving its trail of dark ink, you are participating in an ancient and honored craft. It's a dance of hand, eye, and mind, a process of transforming ephemeral thought into tangible, enduring symbols. Each stroke requires focus, skill, and a deep understanding of the beautiful, complex writing systems that were the glory of ancient Egypt. The careful hand of the scribe was the bridge between the spoken word and the eternal record, patiently building a civilization, one papyrus roll at a time. The scribe's reed pen has moved diligently across the papyrus, column after column of elegant black hieratic or perhaps carefully drawn hieroglyphs filling the scroll. The main body of the text, be it a royal decree, a temple inventory, a literary tale, or a collection of magical spells, is now complete. But for many important ancient Egyptian papyri, the work wasn't finished there. To enhance their beauty, to emphasize key sections, or to add vital visual information. These scrolls were often adorned with intricate illustrations, colorful headings, and decorative borders. You are now witnessing the meticulous art of the Egyptian draftsman and painter, as they transform a functional document into a true work of art, a feast for the eyes as well as the mind. This practice of illustrating papyrus scrolls was particularly prominent in religious and funerary texts. A key historical fact is that the Book of the Dead, more accurately titled by the Egyptians as the Spells for Going Forth by Day, is perhaps the most famous example of elaborately illustrated papyri. These scrolls, often many meters long, were created to guide the deceased through the perils of the afterlife and ensure their successful passage to the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. They were typically filled with magical spells, hymns, and prayers, accompanied by vibrant, detailed illustrations, dukanamonim or vignettes, depicting the deceased undergoing various trials, appearing before the gods, and scenes from the afterlife. These weren't just pretty pictures, they were considered an essential, magically potent part of the scroll, ensuring the efficacy of the spells and the safety of the soul. Imagine your own personal, beautifully illustrated afterlife instruction manual, custom made to get you past all the scary demons and into VIP eternal bliss. Right. This vignette shows me successfully bribing the ferryman of the underworld with a perfectly preserved fig. Good to know. And look, I get a nice halo in the next scene. Excellent. The artists who created these vignettes were highly skilled craftsmen, often working in specialized workshops associated with temples or major funerary ateliers. They would use a fine reed brush and a palette of brightly colored mineral pigments, the same black carbon and red ochre used by the text scribes, but also blues Egyptian blue, greens malachite or chrysocolla, yellows yellow ochre or orpiment, and white gypsum or chalk. These pigments would be ground finely and mixed with a binder, probably gum arabic, to create paints. The style of these illustrations is instantly recognizable. Figures are typically shown in profile with a frontal eye, clear outlines, flat areas of color, and a strong sense of order and hieratic scale. Important figures are often larger. They followed established artistic conventions that had been refined over millennia, ensuring clarity, religious propriety, and a timeless aesthetic. Beyond the elaborate vignettes of funerary scrolls, red ink, as we've noted, was widely used for rubrics from the Latin rubrica, meaning red earth or ochre, reflecting the Roman use of red for headings. Though the practice was much older in Egypt, scribes would use red ink to write titles, chapter headings, opening phrases of spells or prayers, dates, or to highlight important words or instructions within the main black text. This use of red not only made the text easier to navigate and understand, but also added a visual vibrancy to the scroll. It was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of using bold headings, bullet points, and a bit of judicious color coding in a modern document to improve readability. Sometimes, more elaborate decorative borders or cartouche's oval frames enclosing royal names would be added. Particularly for scrolls intended for royalty or high officials, these might involve intricate geometric patterns, floral motifs, or rows of protective symbols. The level of adornment would, of course, depend on the importance of the document and the wealth of the person or institution commissioning it. A simple administrative list from a provincial temple might have only a few red headings, while a pharaoh's personal copy of a sacred text could be a masterpiece of calligraphy and illustration, shimmering with gold leaf. Though gold was used more sparingly on papyrus than in tomb paintings due to cost and flexibility issues. A quirky tidbit is that sometimes the space for illustrations on a scroll would be left blank by the text scribe, with perhaps a brief note indicating what scene should be drawn there. The illustrator would then fill in these spaces later. Occasionally, if the scroll was produced hastily or if funds ran out, these illustration spaces might remain empty, giving us a fascinating glimpse into the production process and the division of labor in the scribal workshop. It's like finding a comic book where the speech bubbles are filled in, but the artist forgot to draw the superheroes. The collaboration between the text scribe and the illustrator, Natsialo painter, would have required careful coordination. The scribe needed to leave appropriate spaces for the vignettes, and the illustrator needed to ensure their images corresponded correctly with the accompanying text. Historians of Egyptian art and papyrology still study these illustrated scrolls in immense detail, analyzing artistic styles, iconographic conventions, the chemical composition of pigments, and the relationship between text and image. They debate, for instance, the extent to which illustrators followed strict, preordained patterns versus having some degree of artistic freedom, or how regional variations in artistic style might be identified. So, as you watch these ancient artists meticulously adding vibrant colors and intricate figures to the papyrus, you realize that a scroll was often much more than just a collection of words. It could be a powerful visual narrative, a sacred object, a beautiful work of art designed to instruct, to protect, and to delight the eye as well as the mind. These adornments transform the humble papyrus roll into a rich, multi-layered testament to the creativity and spiritual depth of ancient Egyptian civilization, ensuring that its whispers were not just heard, but also vividly seen. You're deep in the heart of an ancient Egyptian scribal workshop, the air thick with the scent of papyrus and freshly mixed ink. The reed pens are flying, hieroglyphs are taking shape, and vibrant vignettes are being meticulously painted onto important scrolls. It all seems like a remarkably smooth and efficient operation. But let's be realistic, scribes. Even the most highly trained and divinely inspired ones were human. And humans, as we all know, make mistakes. Whether it was a slip of the reed pen, a momentary lapse in concentration while copying a complex passage, a misheard word during dictation, or simply a pesky fly landing on a freshly inked hieroglyph, errors were an inevitable part of daily scribal life. So, how did these ancient masters of the written word deal with their bloopers? Did they just sigh, crumple up the expensive papyrus, and toss it in the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the recycling bin? Not usually. They had a range of clever, and sometimes rather painstaking techniques for correcting their errors, ensuring that the final scroll was as accurate and aesthetically pleasing as possible. The most common method for correcting a minor error, perhaps a single incorrect sign, a misspelled word, or a small omission, was simply to wash it off. A key historical fact is that the carbon-based black ink used by Egyptian scribes, while remarkably permanent once fully dry and set, was somewhat water-soluble when fresh, or could be gently lifted from the papyrus surface with a damp sponge or cloth shortly after application if a mistake was made quickly. The scribe would carefully moisten the offending mark and then try to blot or rub it away. This had to be done with extreme care, as too much water or overly vigorous rubbing could damage the fragile papyrus surface, making it rough and difficult to write on again. It's like trying to erase pencil from very thin paper. One wrong move and you've got a hole. "Oh, for the love of Thoth," a scribe might exclaim, dabbing gingerly at a smudged unk. That's the third time I've given Pharaoh an extra nostril. My career in royal portraiture is clearly doomed if I keep this up. If washing wasn't an option, or if the error was more substantial? Another common technique was erasure by scraping. The scribe would use a sharp knife, perhaps the same one used for trimming reeds, or a small, abrasive stone like pumice to carefully scrape away the dried ink from the surface of the papyrus. This required immense skill and a very light touch. If done clumsily, it could thin the papyrus too much, creating a weak spot or even a hole. After scraping, the area might need to be smoothed down again with a burnisher like a polished pebble or a piece of ivory to restore a usable writing surface. You can sometimes see evidence of these erasures on surviving ancient papyri, areas where the surface is slightly rougher, or the fibers a bit disturbed, with the corrected text written over the top. It's the ancient equivalent of using a bottle of Tipex, but far more labor-intensive and with a much higher risk of messing it up even further. For more significant errors, such as omitting an entire line or passage, or needing to insert a substantial correction, the scribe had a few options. Sometimes they might write the correction in the margin, with a small mark or symbol indicating where it should be inserted in the main text, much like modern proofreading marks. Or if there was enough space between the lines, they might try to squeeze the correction in, though this could look messy. In some cases, if a whole section was hopelessly muddled, the scribe might take a fresh strip of papyrus, write the corrected passage on it, and then carefully paste this new strip over the erroneous section on the scroll. This was a neat, if somewhat bulky, solution, a kind of ancient cut and paste. A quirky tidbit sometimes these pasted-on corrections, or palimpsests of a sort within a single document, can become detached over time, revealing the original error underneath, giving modern papyrologists a fascinating glimpse into the scribe's working process and their attempts to achieve accuracy. It's like finding the deleted scenes of an ancient Egyptian text. And what if an error was only discovered much later, after the ink had fully set and perhaps even after the scroll had been completed and rolled up? If the scroll was important enough, it might be unrolled again, and a later scribe or editor might add corrections or annotations in the margins, sometimes in a different hand or even a different color of ink. Often red was used for this. These later glosses and corrections are invaluable for scholars today, as they can reveal how texts were read, interpreted, and transmitted over time. Of course, if a mistake was truly catastrophic, or if the papyrus sheet itself was damaged beyond repair during the writing or correction process, the scribe might have no choice but to discard that particular sheet or section of a roll and start again. Given the cost of papyrus, this would have been a painful decision, reserved for only the most egregious blunders. The workshop floor was probably not littered with crumpled up first drafts in the way a modern writer's bin might be. Every sheet was precious. Historians and papyrologists who study ancient Egyptian texts often pay close attention to these corrections and erasures, as they can tell us a lot about scribal practices, levels of literacy and education, the transmission of texts, and even the specific working habits of individual scribes. For example, the frequency and type of errors might indicate whether a scribe was working from dictation, copying from another manuscript, or composing a new text. So, the daily life of an ancient Egyptian scribe wasn't just about elegant calligraphy and profound wisdom. It was also about the very human realities of making mistakes and the painstaking effort required to fix them. Their art was not just one of creation, but also of meticulous correction, a constant striving for accuracy and clarity on the fragile and precious surface of the papyrus page. The pursuit of perfection, even in ancient Egypt, often involved a good deal of careful erasing. The papyrus scrolls are now meticulously prepared. The inks are mixed, the reed pens are sharpened, and the scribes, those masters of ancient Egyptian literacy, are ready to fill these pale surfaces with the words that will define their civilization. But what exactly were they writing? What were the words of ages that they so diligently recorded? From the grand pronouncements destined for temple walls and royal tombs to the more mundane, yet equally fascinating, records of daily life. As you delve into the vast and varied world of ancient Egyptian texts preserved on papyrus, you realize that scribes were the indispensable record keepers, storytellers, administrators, and spiritual guardians of their society, their writings touching almost every facet of human existence along the Nile. Perhaps the most awe-inspiring and visually stunning texts committed to papyrus were the great religious and funerary scrolls, most famously the Book of the Dead. We've touched on these before, but it's worth reiterating their importance. These weren't books in the modern sense, but collections of spells, hymns, prayers, and magical incantations, often lavishly illustrated, designed to guide the deceased safely through the perilous journey of the Duat, the underworld, and ensure their successful rebirth into the afterlife. A key historical fact is that no two copies of the Book of the Dead are exactly alike. Each scroll was often customized for the individual deceased, containing a selection of spells deemed most appropriate or efficacious for them, and often including their name throughout the text. Imagine commissioning your own personalized afterlife guidebook, complete with cheat sheets for passing divine judgment and flattering portraits of you looking suitably pious before Osiris? Right. Make sure Chapter 125, the Negative Confession, is extra clear. I really don't want to mess that bit up when I'm weighing my heart against Ma'at's feather. And can you make my headdress look a bit more regal in Vignette 37? Beyond these elaborate funerary texts, scribes in temple scriptoria, the House of Life, or Perenk, would also meticulously copy and preserve sacred hymns to the gods. temple rituals, mythological narratives, theological treatises, and collections of wisdom literature, texts containing moral advice, proverbs, and reflections on life, often attributed to famous sages or pharaohs. These sacred scrolls were vital for maintaining religious order, performing temple ceremonies correctly, and transmitting the core beliefs of Egyptian civilization across generations. But the daily work of many scribes was often far more worldly, focused on the vast administrative machinery of the Egyptian state and its powerful temple estates. You'd find them diligently recording tax revenues, measures of grain, numbers of livestock, quantities of beer and linen, all meticulously tallied. They kept detailed census records, land surveys crucial in a land whose boundaries were annually redefined by the Nile's inundation, and lists of laborers conscripted for state projects like pyramid building or canal digging. They drafted official correspondence between government departments, recorded royal decrees and edicts, and kept the minutes of legal proceedings. Without these scribal records, the complex bureaucracy of ancient Egypt, which managed to function with remarkable efficiency for millennia, would have simply collapsed. It was the original empire built on triplicate forms, though thankfully for them, it was mostly just single-copy papyrus originals. Okay, Rekmir. A senior official might say to his scribe, "We need a full inventory of the royal granaries at Thebes by tomorrow, a list of all conscripted quarrymen for the new obelisk project. And can you also draft a rather strongly worded letter to that delinquent Nubian chieftain about his overdue tribute of giraffe tails, chop chop?" Literary texts also found their way onto papyrus. While much ancient Egyptian literature was likely part of a vibrant oral tradition, scribes also recorded epic poems, myths, magical tales, love songs, satirical stories, and works of fiction. Famous examples include the Tale of Sinu, a narrative of an Egyptian official's adventures in exile, the Story of the Eloquent Peasant, a remarkable series of pleas for justice, and various collections of wisdom teachings. These texts give us invaluable insights into Egyptian storytelling, their sense of humor, their moral values, and their understanding of the human condition. A quirky and very human category of texts found on papyrus are personal letters. Scribes, being among the literate few, often acted as letter writers and readers for others. These letters cover a vast range of everyday concerns, family news, business arrangements, complaints about lazy servants, requests for favors, expressions of affection, and even anxieties about health or the afterlife. They offer a wonderfully intimate glimpse into the daily lives and personal relationships of ordinary and not so ordinary ancient Egyptians. It's like reading someone's ancient Egyptian email inbox. Dearest Merit, hope the crocodiles haven't eaten the children. The Nile inundation was a bit feeble this year. Send more dates. Love, your husband. Currently stuck supervising a pyramid construction site and really missing your fig cakes. Medical texts, too, were a significant genre, with papyri like the Ebers Papyrus and the Edwin Smith Papyrus detailing diagnoses, prognoses, and treatments for a wide range of ailments, from common colds and broken bones to more mysterious afflictions attributed to GGRE gods or malevolent spirits. These texts combined practical medical knowledge with magical incantations, reflecting the Egyptian understanding of health and illness as an interplay of physical and supernatural forces. Historians and Egyptologists continue to discover, decipher, and debate the vast corpus of surviving Egyptian papyri. Each new fragment, each rereading of a known text, can offer fresh insights into this ancient civilization. There is ongoing discussion, for example, about literacy rates beyond the professional scribal class. How many ordinary Egyptians could read or write to some degree? And how did the types of texts produced and preserved change over Egypt's long history? Reflecting shifts in political power, religious beliefs, and cultural priorities, what is abundantly clear is that the papyrus scroll was the indispensable medium for nearly every form of recorded human activity in ancient Egypt. From the most sacred hymns intoned in temples to the most mundane laundry lists, yes, Those have been found too. The words of ages were entrusted to these humble, yet remarkably enduring rolls of reed. The scribes who filled them were not just copyists, they were the guardians of memory, the architects of administration, the tellers of tales, and the keepers of a flame of knowledge that still flickers for us today, thanks to the enduring whispers from their papyrus. The ancient Egyptian scribe has meticulously crafted the papyrus scroll, filled its columns with elegant hieroglyphs or swift hieratic script, perhaps even adorned it with vibrant vignettes. The words of ages, be they sacred spells, administrative decrees, literary tales, or personal letters, are now entrusted to this fragile, yet surprisingly resilient, medium. But what happens next? How were these precious rolls of knowledge stored, organized, and protected from the ravages of time, pests, and human carelessness in ancient Egypt? You're now stepping into the quiet, dusty, and vitally important world of ancient Egyptian archives and libraries, the places where these fragile rolls of wisdom were kept, hopefully for eternity, or at least until the next royal inventory. The concept of an archive or library, a dedicated space for storing and accessing written records, was well established in ancient Egypt from very early periods. Temples, royal palaces, government administrative centers, and even some wealthy private households would have maintained collections of papyrus scrolls relevant to their functions and interests. These weren't lending libraries in the modern sense, where you could just pop in and check out the latest bestseller on chariot maintenance for dummies. Access was often restricted, and the scrolls themselves were valuable commodities. Guarded with care, it was more like a high-security, climate-controlled by ancient standards vault for irreplaceable intellectual property. How were the scrolls physically stored? Typically, a papyrus roll, once completed and perhaps tied with a strip of papyrus or leather, would be placed inside a protective container. This could be a cylindrical wooden or pottery jar, a leather satchel, or sometimes a wooden box or chest. These containers help to shield the delicate papyrus from dust, excessive light which can degrade papyrus over time, moisture a major enemy, as dampness encourages mold and decay, and insect pests like bookworms, or rather, scrollworms. In this case, a key historical fact is that many of the papyri that have survived to this day owe their preservation to the extremely dry climate of certain parts of Egypt, particularly desert cemeteries or settlements on the desert fringe, where they were buried in tombs or discarded in ancient rubbish heaps and remained undisturbed for millennia. The official archives in more humid populated areas like the Nile Delta have, sadly, largely perished. So, ironically, some of our best preserved ancient trash is now priceless historical treasure. One pharaoh's discarded shopping list, a future archaeologist might say, is another historian's key to understanding 18th dynasty grocery prices. Fascinating. Within these archives or libraries, the scrolls would need to be organized for retrieval. Imagine trying to find one specific administrative decree or a particular chapter of a medical text amidst thousands of identical-looking papyrus rolls. It would be a nightmare. So, labeling was crucial. Scribes would often attach a small tag, or syllabos as the Greeks later called it, to the end of a scroll. This tag, made of papyrus, wood, or ivory, would protrude when the scroll was rolled up and stored, and it would typically bear the title of the work. Perhaps the author's name if known or relevant, and maybe a brief note about its contents or a classification mark. These syllaboi were the ancient equivalent of the spine label on a modern book. The scrolls themselves would then be stored in various ways. They might be laid horizontally in stacks on wooden shelves, or placed upright in pottery jars or chests, often with their syllaboi visible for easy identification. In some temple libraries or royal archives, dedicated rooms with built-in niches or cupboards like those depicted in some tomb reliefs showing scribal activities would have been used for organized storage. The House of Life. Perunk. The scriptorium and library attached to major temples would have been a particularly important center for the creation. storage, and study of religious, scientific, and literary texts. These were the intellectual powerhouses of ancient Egypt, staffed by highly educated priests and scribes. You can imagine the head librarian of the Per Ankh, a very learned and probably rather stern individual, insisting on absolute order. Imhotep Jr. I told you, the scrolls on advanced embalming techniques go on the third shelf. After. Hymns to Ra. Not mixed in with popular love spells for bewitching your neighbor's ox. We have a system here, a quirky, though perhaps apocryphal. Tidbit is the idea that some ancient libraries might have employed snakes or other sacred animals to guard their precious scrolls from pests like mice or rats. While this sounds wonderfully exotic, more practical methods probably involved careful sealing of storage containers and perhaps the use of certain aromatic herbs or minerals with insect-repellent properties. However, the image of a sacred cobra silently patrolling the papyrus stacks certainly adds a certain frisson to the idea of ancient librarianship. The preservation of these fragile rolls was an ongoing concern. Scribes or library attendants would periodically need to inspect the collection, repair damaged scrolls, perhaps unroll and re-roll them to prevent them from becoming too brittle or stuck together, and ensure that the storage conditions were as optimal as possible, meaning dry and relatively cool. Despite their best efforts, papyrus is an organic material, and over centuries many scrolls inevitably succumbed to decay, insect damage, fire, flood, or simply the ravages of time and human conflict. What survives today is only a tiny fraction of what once existed. Historians and papyrologists still debate the exact layout and organization of major ancient Egyptian archival centers, like the main temple libraries or the royal chanceries. How were their collections cataloged beyond simple silly boy? Were there more extensive finding aids or inventory lists? How were scribes trained in archival management? The discovery of new papyri, or the re-examination of existing ones, continually sheds new light on these questions. What is certain is that the ancient Egyptians placed a high value on the written word and understood the importance of preserving their records, their sacred texts, and their literary heritage. Their systems of labeling, storing, and maintaining papyrus scrolls, developed over millennia, were a testament to their sophisticated organizational skills and their deep reverence for the enduring power of writing. These ancient archives were not just dusty storehouses. They were the living memory of a civilization, carefully tended by generations of ink-stained scroll keepers, ensuring that the whispers from those fragile reeds could, with luck and a very dry climate, echo down to us. The papyrus scroll, meticulously crafted from the Nile's bounty and inscribed with the wisdom, laws, and stories of ancient Egypt, was far more than just a domestic writing material. It became one of Egypt's most significant and highly prized exports, a valuable trade commodity that fueled not only the intellectual life of the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, but also contributed significantly to Egypt's own economic prosperity and cultural influence for millennia. You're now looking beyond the individual scribe and the local workshop to see papyrus as a major player in the ancient global economy, a kind of paper gold that everyone wanted a piece of. From a very early period, Egypt held a virtual monopoly on the production of high-quality papyrus. The Cyperus papyrus plant, while it grew in a few other marshy areas around the Mediterranean like Sicily or parts of Mesopotamia, thrived most abundantly and produced the best raw material for papermaking in the unique conditions of the Nile Delta and its surrounding wetlands. The Egyptians had perfected the complex art of transforming this reed into a superb writing surface, a skill that other cultures, even if they had access to the plant, often struggled to replicate with the same level of quality and consistency. This gave Egypt a powerful economic advantage. It's like having exclusive rights to the world's best coffee beans or the only source of a particularly fine silk. Everyone who wants the good stuff has to come to you. Oh, you want to write down your epic poem, Mr. Homer? Or perhaps draft some new laws? Solon of Athens. You'll be needing some of our finest Egyptian papyrus for that. Cash, or will this be on the Royal Athenian expense account? The demand for papyrus throughout the ancient world was immense, as literacy and administrative complexity grew in neighboring civilizations in the Levant, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and especially in the burgeoning Greek city-states, and later the Hellenistic kingdoms and the Roman Empire. So too did the need for a reliable, high-quality writing material. Stone tablets were cumbersome. Clay tablets were brittle and bulky for long texts. And wooden writing boards covered with wax were reusable but not ideal for permanent records or extensive literary works. Papyrus offered the perfect solution. It was relatively lightweight, flexible when fresh and properly prepared, could be easily rolled for storage and transport, and provided a smooth, receptive surface for ink. A key historical fact is that papyrus became the standard writing material for literature. Official documents and personal correspondence throughout the Greek and Roman worlds for over 1,000 years, from roughly the 7th century BCE until it was gradually superseded by parchment and then true paper in the later Roman and early medieval periods. Almost every classical Greek or Latin text that has come down to us was originally written, or copied, on Egyptian papyrus. This widespread demand fueled a thriving papyrus export trade from Egypt. Merchant ships laden with bundles of papyrus rolls would sail from Alexandria and other Egyptian ports, carrying this precious cargo to markets across the Mediterranean. The Ptolemaic rulers, and later the Roman emperors who controlled Egypt, undoubtedly profited greatly from this trade, either through direct state control of papyrus production and export, or through taxation of the private workshops and merchants involved. Papyrus was a strategic commodity, much like grain, another of Egypt's major exports, and its supply could be used as a tool of diplomacy or economic pressure. Remember that story about Ptolemy supposedly embargoing papyrus exports to Pergamum to stifle its rival library? While the details are debated, it illustrates the geopolitical significance of controlling this vital resource. A quirky tidbit about the papyrus trade is the variation in quality and price. Not all papyrus was created equal. The finest, whitest, smoothest sheets, known as hieratic papyrus in Roman times, not to be confused with the hieratic script, though this quality was indeed often used for sacred texts, commanded the highest prices and was favored for important documents and luxury book rolls. Cheaper, rougher grades, perhaps made from the outer parts of the pith or from less carefully processed stalks, were available for more everyday uses like school exercises, business accounts, or ephemeral notes. There was a whole spectrum of papyrus quality, catering to different needs and budgets, much like the different grades of paper available today, from cheap newsprint to expensive archival cotton rag. You could probably tell a lot about someone's status by the quality of the papyrus they used for their grocery lists. Look at Lord Maremta's discarded notes for his chariot race bets. Only the finest, smoothest double-laminated papyrus for him. Meanwhile, I'm stuck trying to write my love poems on this stuff that feels like recycled donkey fodder. The production of papyrus for export would have been a major industry in Egypt, employing thousands of people, from the harvesters in the marshes and the artisans in the workshops to the merchants, shippers, and administrators who managed the trade. It was a source of considerable wealth and employment. Historians and economists who study ancient trade networks continue to piece together the roots, volumes, and economic impact of the Egyptian papyrus trade. How much did fluctuations in Nile flood levels, which affected papyrus growth, impact supply and prices in distant Rome or Athens? How did political instability in Egypt or wars in the Mediterranean disrupt the flow of this essential commodity? The answers to these questions help us understand the interconnectedness of the ancient world and the profound reliance of its intellectual and administrative life on this single, remarkable Egyptian plant. For centuries, the rhythmic work of the papyrus makers along the Nile didn't just supply the needs of Egypt itself. It quite literally provided the pages upon which much of the classical world wrote its history, its philosophy, its poetry, and its laws. The humble reed, transformed by Egyptian ingenuity, became a cornerstone of ancient literacy and a vital thread in the complex web of Mediterranean commerce and culture. Egypt wasn't just exporting grain, it was exporting the very means of knowledge itself. For millennia, the papyrus roll, born from the fertile banks of the Nile, reigned supreme as the dominant writing material of the ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds. Its smooth, pale surface carried the weight of empires, the whispers of poets, the calculations of mathematicians, and the sacred texts of priests. You've seen how it was meticulously made, how scribes filled it with their elegant script, how it was stored in ancient archives. But like all empires, the reign of papyrus eventually began to face challenges, and new rivals emerged to contest its dominance. As antiquity gave way to the early medieval period, the humble reed found its position increasingly threatened by parchment and, much later, by true paper, leading to a gradual but ultimately decisive shift in the very fabric of written communication. The first major challenger to papyrus was parchment. Parchment, as you might recall from our brief mention when discussing the library rivalry between Alexandria and Pergamum, is made from treated animal skins, typically sheep, goat, or calf. A key historical fact is that while animal skins had been used as writing surfaces in various cultures for a very long time, it was in the Hellenistic period, particularly in Pergamum around the 2nd century BCE, that the process for producing high-quality, thin, smooth, and durable parchment was significantly refined and popularized. The traditional story, as told by Pliny the Elder, attributes this development to a Ptolemaic embargo on papyrus exports to Pergamum, forcing King Eumenes Zaku to find an alternative. Whether this story is entirely accurate or not, and historians debate its literal truth, it highlights the growing need for reliable writing material that wasn't solely dependent on Egyptian supply. Parchment had several distinct advantages over papyrus. It was significantly more durable and less prone to tearing or damage from moisture. It could be produced anywhere there were animals, thus breaking Egypt's natural monopoly on papyrus production. Both sides of a parchment sheet could be written on with equal ease, unlike papyrus, where the verso side with its vertical fibers was often rougher, and crucially for the later development of the book. Parchment sheets could be easily folded and stitched together to form a codex, the familiar book format with individual pages that we use today, which was much more convenient for navigating lengthy text than a long, cumbersome scroll. Imagine trying to quickly find a specific passage in a 30-foot-long papyrus scroll versus flipping through the pages of a codex. The codex was the ancient equivalent of a user-friendly interface upgrade. Honestly, trying to cross-reference 3 different papyrus scrolls at once is a nightmare. An early Christian scholar might complain, if only someone would invent a way to have multiple pages open at the same time without needing 6 extra slaves to hold them all. Oh, wait, this parchment codex thing from Pergamum looks promising. However, parchment also had its disadvantages, especially initially. It was generally more expensive to produce than papyrus. As it required the skin of an animal, a single large book might need the skins of many sheep. The preparation process was also labor-intensive, involving soaking, scraping, stretching, and smoothing the skins. So, for many centuries, papyrus and parchment coexisted, often used for different purposes or in different regions depending on availability and cost. Papyrus remained the preferred material for everyday documents, letters, and less formal literary works in Egypt and much of the Roman world for a long time, while parchment gained favor for more durable, high-value books, particularly in areas where papyrus was harder to obtain, or for texts that needed to withstand heavy use, like legal codes or important religious scriptures. A quirky tidbit from this period of transition is the continued use of the term papyrus, or its cognates in some contexts, even when referring to books made of parchment. Much like we still talk about paperwork, even when most of it is digital. The cultural prestige of papyrus as the traditional writing material was slow to fade. The real death knell for papyrus in the Mediterranean world, however, came with 2 major developments. First, the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century CE disrupted the traditional trade routes and, over time, perhaps led to changes in papyrus production and export. though papyrus continued to be made and used in Egypt itself for several more centuries, and was even exported to Europe for certain official documents like papal bulls well into the medieval period. Second, and more decisively, was the gradual spread of true paper-making technology from China. Paper made from pulped plant fibers like linen rags, hemp, or mulberry bark was invented in China around the 2nd century CE. It was cheaper to produce than parchment and offered a smoother, more versatile writing surface than papyrus for many applications. This technology slowly made its way westward along the Silk Road, reaching the Islamic world by the 8th century and then spreading into Europe via Spain and Italy from the 11th and 12th centuries onwards. By the late medieval period in Europe, paper was increasingly replacing both papyrus, which was now very scarce outside of Egypt, and parchment, which remained expensive as the standard writing material for most purposes. The rise of the printing press in the mid-15th century, which required vast quantities of a cheap and reliable writing surface, further accelerated the dominance of paper. Historians and paleographers still debate the exact timelines and regional variations in the decline of papyrus use and the adoption of parchment and paper. It wasn't an overnight switch, but a long, overlapping transition influenced by economic factors, technological developments, cultural preferences, and even environmental changes in the Nile Delta that might have affected papyrus cultivation. And so, the humble reed that had served as Egypt's sacred page for millennia, the material that had carried the wisdom of pharaohs and the brilliance of Alexandrian scholars, gradually receded into the background of history. Its rivals, born of animal hide and pulped rags, offered new advantages in durability, cost, and convenience, particularly for the codex book format that would come to dominate the Western intellectual tradition. The whispers from papyrus grew fainter, its kingdom slowly usurped, but its contribution, as we shall see, was far from forgotten. The Age of Papyrus. That long and glorious reign of the Nile reed as the principal carrier of human thought in the ancient Mediterranean world has drawn to a close. Parchment and then paper have risen to take its place, offering new practicalities for a changing world. The bustling papyrus workshops along the Nile have fallen silent. The once vast thickets of cyperus papyrus have shrunk, and the art of transforming its pith into smooth, pale sheets is largely forgotten, only to be rediscovered by curious scholars and dedicated craftspeople in modern times. Yet, as you stand at the end of this long historical journey, you realize that the whispers from those ancient reeds, though perhaps faint and carried on the dry desert wind, have left an indelible, profoundly important legacy for all of humanity. The most direct and undeniable legacy of papyrus is, of course, the vast body of ancient Egyptian texts that have survived upon its surface. Without this remarkably durable in the right conditions writing material, our understanding of one of the world's oldest and most fascinating civilizations would be immeasurably poorer. A key historical fact is that virtually everything we know about ancient Egyptian history, religion, literature, medicine, mathematics, and daily life, beyond what is carved on stone monuments, comes from inscribed papyrus scrolls and fragments. From the grand theological speculations of the Book of the Dead to the meticulous administrative records of a temple estate, from the epic tales of Sinuhe to the intimate personal letters between family members, papyrus was the medium that preserved Egypt's voice across the millennia. It allows us to hear the pharaohs speak, to understand the anxieties of ordinary people, to marvel at their scientific achievements, and to be moved by their poetry. It's like finding a direct data line to a long-lost civilization, all thanks to a humble swamp plant. If these reeds could talk, you might muse, oh, the stories they would tell. And thankfully, because of the scribes, they do talk. Beyond Egypt itself. Papyrus served as the primary vehicle for the transmission of classical Greek and Roman literature for centuries. As we saw with the Great Library of Alexandria, vast collections of Greek texts were copied and preserved on Egyptian papyrus. Many of these works only survived into the medieval period, when they could be recopied onto more durable parchment, because they had first been entrusted to papyrus rolls. Even if the original Alexandrian scrolls are lost, the textual tradition they help to establish and transmit forms the very foundation of Western classical scholarship. Our editions of Homer, Plato, Euripides, and countless other ancient authors owe a profound debt to those long-gone Alexandrian scribes and their rolls of Nile paper. The very word paper, as we've noted, is a direct linguistic descendant of papyrus, a constant, everyday reminder of this ancient material's foundational role. The scroll format itself, though largely superseded by the codex, the paged book, also left its mark. Think of how we still scroll through digital documents on our computer screens. The terminology is a ghostly echo of unrolling an ancient papyrus. A quirky, though perhaps slightly anachronistic, way to think about papyrus's legacy is to consider it the ancient world's first truly successful information storage and retrieval system. It was relatively lightweight, portable when rolled, easy to write on with practice, and could last for centuries, even millennia, if kept in dry conditions. It allowed for the accumulation and transmission of knowledge on a scale previously unimaginable, laying the groundwork for the great libraries and intellectual achievements of antiquity. It wasn't as high density as a modern hard drive, and of course, you couldn't fit the entire internet onto a single papyrus roll, unless it was a very long roll and written in incredibly tiny hieroglyphs. But for its time, it was a revolutionary technology. The rediscovery of large quantities of ancient papyri in Egypt in the late 19th and 20th centuries, often preserved by the dry desert sands in ancient rubbish dumps or mummy wrappings, led to the birth of a whole new academic discipline, papyrology. Papyrologists meticulously study these fragile fragments, deciphering their texts and piecing together invaluable information about the daily life, administration, literature, and languages of the ancient world, not just in Egypt but across the Hellenistic and Roman empires where papyrus was widely used. These whispers from the rubbish heaps continue to offer fresh insights and challenge old assumptions. Historians still debate the full extent of papyrus's influence on the development of literacy and intellectual culture in the ancient world. Did its relative affordability compared to, say, parchment in its early days contribute to a wider spread of reading and writing? Or was its use still largely confined to elite and professional circles? The picture is complex and varied across different periods and regions. But what remains beyond debate is the profound debt we owe to this remarkable plant and the ancient Egyptian ingenuity that transformed it into a vessel for human thought. The scribes who harvested the reeds, crafted the sheets, mixed the inks, and patiently inscribed the words were not just performing a daily task, they were weaving the very fabric of history, creating a bridge of understanding that allows us to connect with a distant past. The whispers from those ancient papyrus reeds, though sometimes faint and fragmented, still speak to us of a world of gods and pharaohs, of poets and philosophers, of everyday joys and sorrows, all captured on the sacred page born from the Nile. Their legacy is not just in our museums and libraries, it's in the very DNA of our literate world. And so, our journey through the ancient world of papyrus making, from the verdant Nile marshes to the scribe's skilled hand and the archives where these precious scrolls were kept, gently comes to its end. We have followed the path of this humble reed as it was transformed into the very paper of antiquity, the carrier of dreams, decrees, and divine utterances. The meticulous care of the harvesters, the artistry of the sheet makers, the patient skill of the scribes, all contributed to a legacy that has profoundly shaped our understanding of one of the world's most captivating ancient civilizations. As the image of those ink-stained fingers and those elegantly inscribed rolls begins to fade from your mind, let the quiet rustle of papyrus be replaced by the soothing rhythm of your own breath. The knowledge they preserved, the stories they told, have done their work for tonight. May you now find a peaceful and restorative slumber, your own thoughts as smooth and untroubled as a freshly polished papyrus sheet, awaiting the light of a new day. End of script. Sweet dreams.